Hi everyone, welcome to the Swift Arcade. I'm your host, Jonathan Rasmussen. So excited to have you here today. Today we're going to take a look and see how Combine plus UIKit works. Combine is a really cool event processing framework. It's used extensively in Swift UI, but we can use it today in our UIKit applications. So if you want to see what Combine is, how it works, and 3 examples of how you can use it in your UIKit applications today, come on in and together we'll take a look and see how this framework works. All right, let's start off by just asking ourselves, what exactly is Combine? Combine is a unified Swift API framework for processing events over time. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, the events we're talking about here are mostly asynchronous ones, the kind that fire continuously when our apps are running. What Combine does is it takes all these different asynchronous events that can happen in our application and combines them into one stream of logic. One stream we can reason about, write code against, and figure out when all these things occur in our app continuously, how do we want our app to respond, and even bind the state of this logic to some of the controls in our app. That at its heart is what Combine is. Okay, but where and how would we use something like this? Well, let's say that we're building a wizard registration application where wizards come in, they enter a name, they enter a password and a repeat password, and we just want to enable that button down here at the bottom if all of these events occur. If we weren't using Combine, let's just first appreciate all the event processing going on in here. We have target action for when someone presses any of these text fields, they have to enter some text. We've got a timer going on here because this is going to be a call to a backend web service, and we don't want to hammer our backend every time someone does a key press. So we're going to debounce that. Then we might use KVO to update the other parts of our view controller and let them know that, hey, someone's actually entered a name here. And then finally enable that if all of these things are true. That's just some of the processing we have to write without using Combine. With Combine, however, we can merge all this eventing together. We can take the result of a wizard name being entered. We can take the results and compare the passwords being entered. And all of this eventing we can combine into one stream, write logic against, and then finally enable our account button down here if all of those things are true. So when all of these things happen, we want to enable this button. That's kind of a really good example of how we could use Combine in a plain old regular UIKit application today. But before we actually go in there and solve this particular problem with some real code, let's take a look at an even simpler example. One where we simply take some text, enter it into a text field, and then when someone hits this publish button, we automatically update and copy that text from the text field into this label. Let's now enter the arcade and see how this would work. Okay, before we jump into the application, let's quickly look at 3 high-level abstractions you need to understand in order to really get how Combine works. And that is publishers, operators, and subscribers. Publishers are anything that can fire events in Combine. For example, in our application here, we're going to use Notification Center to broadcast new blog posts, and that's going to be our publisher for the application. So we're going to set up a publisher. We're going to use the default Notification Center. We're going to use just this name to broadcast it. And we're going to fire and emit a notification, which we'll then ultimately want to transform and bind to our label. Now, the problem is that notification centers emit notifications, but we need to somehow map that into a string to bind it to our label. For that, we have operators. Operators take the output of publishers and transform them into forms that our subscribers can actually use. In this case, we want a string. So the publisher in this case emits a notification. We're going to use the map operator to take that notification and transform that into a string, which we can then assign to the label. And then the last piece is subscribers. Subscribers are the things that actually subscribe to the things that we're publishing or emitting. So in this case, we're going to create a subscriber, and we're going to say that subscriber is assigned to the label, And the thing we're interested in updating in the label is the text. And we're going to take the output of that publisher, the string, subscribe it to the text of that label, and that's how we're going to bind the text of that label to the publication of that notification center. Then finally, when we're ready to make it all happen, we're going to fire the event. In this case, when that publish button is tapped, we're just going to take the text from the text field, create a new blog post, and then fire it up through a notification center like this. And that's ultimately going to take the text of that blog post and use it to update our label just like this. Okay, let's just jump into the code now and go through this one more time to see how this all actually works. Okay, so here I have my storyboard with my 3 elements set up as IB outlets, my text field, my button, and my label. And let's just look at the code now, the view controller, to see how all this works. Here we're just setting up our notification, giving it the name that we're going to broadcast under. Here's the simple struct called blog post. But check this out. This is all the code we need in its entirety to make all of that work. Let's start with that publisher. Here's our publisher, the notification center, which is just going to fire a blog post out and basically transform and operate and take the output of that notification and map it into something we can understand, in this case, a string. So when you're looking at this code, I know how confusing this looks at first because I've looked at it for a long time. Just understand this publisher is basically going to publish a notification, which we're going to get here. And then we're going to take that notification object we send out, which for us is a blog post because we fired it down here through this blog post. We're going to take that blog post, grab the title, and if the title's empty, we'll just return an empty string. But basically, we're returning a string here. We're operating on this notification, returning a string, and that's what's going to be emitted from this publisher. So in this line here, we're basically describing a subscriber. We're saying, hey, the object we want to bind to is our label. We want to bind to the text here using this key value path. And then finally, we're going to take that subscriber, subscribe to our publisher, and that's what's going to take the string from here and bind it to the text of that label here. And that's basically it. Here we fire the event. We basically just read when that publication button is tapped. We read the text from the text field, create a blog post, fire it up, Bob's your uncle. That's probably one of the simplest examples we can use of Combine in our UIKit applications today. And that's just a really simple case of how it works. Okay, so that's a simple example of how we can use a built-in foundation notification center to broadcast events out into our application. But there's an even more convenient way of doing this, one where we can simply take properties and turn them into publishers by adding one simple attribute. Let's take a look now at another example and see how using the published attribute actually works. Okay, in the second example, we're going to take a look at a simple terms and conditions application. Here we only want the submit button to be enabled when both conditions have been met and someone enters a valid name. So right now this button is disabled. As I turn each of these switches on, however, and I enter some text, we will then see that logic will be processed and this button will enable only after all 3 of these conditions are met. Now let's take a look and see how we could solve this problem using Combine in UIKit. Okay, so the way the second example works is normally if we were solving this without Combine, we would want to define, say, 3 attributes to track the state of each of these settings. So we might have a variable called accepted terms, which would track whether or not this switch is on or off. We might have a variable tracking whether or not they've accepted the privacy terms, and then finally one for the name here. So we could set up target actions. Every time someone switches or enters text here, we could update these properties and then write a configuration function to basically process their state and ultimately decide whether or not to enable this button. No Combine required. But what Combine can do with the published attribute is make it really easy for us to basically turn these properties into publishers. by simply adding this published attribute onto these properties. Every time one of these changes, because we've tied them to the target action here, these will broadcast out events. These are publishers. They will broadcast when their state changes, and then we can hook in and use the combine logic to actually write some processing and then tie that to the state of the submit button. Let's now jump into the code and see how this would work. Okay, so here's our storyboard with our outlets bound to the accepted switches, the name field, and the submit button. And let's just take a look and see how the combine here would actually work. So here's our publishers. These are the things that are going to track the state of whether or not they've accepted these terms and conditions or entered text. And all we're going to do here is add this publish attribute, and these will be magically transformed into publishers. And the way this happens behind the scenes is this is using something that was added in Swift 5.1. These are actually property wrappers. That's what this attribute means. But when you look at it, understand that these things can now broadcast or publish their messages. Next, and watch this, here we really feel the power of Combine. We can create a publisher which takes the state of all three of these published attributes up here and combines them into one. We're basically going to create a publisher. We're going to create a map which takes the three bound properties we defined here, and we access those with that $sign. That's what enables us to access the property wrapper of these attributes. And then with them, we can apply whatever logic we want. For example, here we can say if the terms are true, and if privacy is true, in other words, if they've accepted the terms and the privacy and the name isn't empty, we can then return a Boolean from here, basically saying this is now valid to submit, and that's what our publisher is going to do. So we're really defining a publisher as a var here, taking these three inputs, combining them into the one, and then returning a Boolean publisher, which is never going to fail. And basically this line here takes the input or the internals of how we're mapping and just genericizes it to this any publisher coming out. It really just hides the internal APIs coming here. So you'll see this a lot when using Combine to erase to any publisher. So that's how we can set up our publisher. Next, we need to subscribe to it. How do we do that? Well, we're going to create a variable here called button subscriber any cancelable. What that means is publishers work with class-based instances. Like we're in a UI view controller here. Because we're in a class and we don't want our memory to leak, we're going to create a var here, and this thing's going to be nicely cleaned up by us simply making it the type any cancelable. So this button subscriber now here, we can come down here and we can define and hook it up to that valid to submit that we defined up here. So our subscriber is going to subscribe to this publisher, and what's it going to do? It's going to do a couple things. One is we're going to ensure that whatever comes out of that valid to submit publisher, it's going to be returned to us on the main thread. That's what receive on main run loop does. And then here's that assigned to again. We're going to take the output of that publisher, which is going to be a bool, and we're going to tie it to the is enabled of our submit button. That's what couples or binds the output of this publisher to the state of this control. And that's really it. The rest of these are just IB actions, tying the state of our switch to the accepted terms, the accepted privacy, and the text. And then down here, we're just setting up some view delegate stuff for the text field. But that's all the code it takes for us to basically have these kinds of terms and conditions set up, and then bind the state to that submit button down here and make it all work. Really beautiful, really elegant. All right, let's bring it all home and return to our wizard example and see how we can create an app that basically monitors these three states of fields, does some logic, and then only enables the button down here if text has been entered as a name, passwords have been entered, and both of these passwords match. How could we do that? Okay, well, here's the code very quickly at a high level. We can define our publishers like this, password, password again, username. Those are going to be tied to these fields here. We're going to find 3 different publishers. We're going to validate the username, this guy up here, using some code here. And this is going to call into our backend service, use something called a feature and a promise to make sure we get back a result. And that's going to do the validation there. Then we're going to validate our passwords, where we're going to take 2 passwords coming in, our password, password again, do some validation here. And then we're finally going to combine both of those, the username and the validated password, into a validated credential publisher. And that's what we're going to use down here when we set up our subscriber. We're going to take the create button, go to the validated credentials, and then tie that to the state of the enabled button. Okay, lots going on there. Let's break it down and see how it actually works.
Prepare to qualify.
Okay, because there is a lot going on with this example, I created this picture just to kind of try to show you what's going on. And once you see it, hopefully it actually isn't that bad. Here's our wizard application. And to start off with, we're just going to define our 3 published property wrappers using this published attribute for password, password again, and username. Think of these as states that are going to broadcast their state when they change, and they're tied to the target action of these buttons. So when these things change, these things broadcast. Okay, let's now shift our gears and look at the publishers. And here we've got 3. One, we've got a validated username. This is going to be a publisher, which is going to return an optional string, basically of the username here. So here we're doing a whole bunch of really cool operations. We're using a debounce to make sure that whenever someone types in here, we only send requests to our backend server every 0.5 seconds. We're going to make sure we do that on the main run loop, and we're going to remove any duplicates, meaning if someone types the word Harry here and then they type backspace Harry again, we're not going to send that again to our backend service. We're going to remove duplicates, just one of the operators we get for free on here when we bind to that username. Then check this out. This is an interesting one. It's called flat map. Don't worry about the details of here too much. These would be a video on their own. But basically, futures and promises are how we can asynchronously call backend services like this one here, username available. This is a fake service, which is basically calling our backend, checking the state of that username, and then it's going to return a Boolean, true or false, on whether or not this username is available. That's what's going on with this publisher here. And then again, we're taking the results of flat map, genericizing it with a race to any publisher, and that's what allows it to have this method signature up here. So this is going to return us our username and validate it. Then check this out here. We've got 2 fields here, password and repeat password. Here we're going to use that combine latest, and by binding to password and password again, which again are attributes we define here, published, we're going to take the results of those and map them. In this case, we just want to take the password and the password reset and check and see, are these passwords equal? And is the password count greater than 0? If they're not, we're going to return nil, an optional string representing the password, the valid password that comes out of here. Nil if it's not valid. But if it is valid, in other words, if these conditions are met, we can take the output of this map, check to see whether it's nil, check to also make sure it doesn't equal something simple like password 1. And if that's okay, we're just going to return the password here. I know there's a lot of Swift going on here, but this is something you're going to eventually get more and more comfortable with as you're working with these publishers. Lots of nil operators and stuff like that. And then again, our race to publisher. Then finally down here, this is kind of where the magic happens. This is where we're going to set the state of our create button. We're going to create one more validated credential and just check this out. We're taking these publishers and actually using them in this combine latest line here. This is really cool, and this is kind of what Combine does a lot. It lets you combine operations and processes for parts of your UI and combine them together and take the result and output them here. In this case, we just want to take our validated username and our validated password, which are going to be returned from these publishers here. We get them here and we can map them, meaning we can basically do whatever we want. In this case, we're just going to unwrap username, make sure it's not nil, unwrap password, make sure it's not nil. If either of those are nil, we'll return a nil tuple here. A tuple is just a struct containing two things inside it. But if they are not nil and they're okay, we're just going to return the username and the password as a tuple here and basically make those up and available to whoever needs them. Now we can subscribe. Finally, we come down to our subscribe button here. We're going to bind or just tie ourselves out to this validated credential. And even though we aren't actually going to use the username and password passed out of here, we just want to check and see, is this tuple nil? If it is nil, we're going to return and get out of there. But if it's not, we're going to just continue processing, make sure we're on the main run loop, and then finally tie the state of that. Is this thing equal to nil? If it's not, we can go true and enable the button. And if it is nil, it'll be false and the button will remain disabled. And that's kind of it. Here's the code in its entirety. You can see how we just set up the publishers, set up the validators, and this is all the code it takes to do that really cool thing we saw in the app there. Not a lot of code, really, really powerful, and a really nice example of how we can use Combine, bringing it all together in a UIKit application just like this. Okay, everyone, how did that go? This video is getting long. I'm going to wrap this up very quickly, I promise. We covered a lot in there, and Combine is a big subject, so don't feel bad at all if you feel overwhelmed. I've been studying this stuff for about a month, and believe me, it's not easy at first. There's a whole bunch of new concepts to understand. The syntax looks really weird, and it took me a long time just to get this basic level of understanding. But if you want to dive into this deeper, here's what I want you to do. Go ahead and head over to my repo here, SwiftUI. I've got an example README file which walks you through everything we talked about here in slow motion so you can kind of understand what's going on. And then here's what I want you to do. I want you just to download the sample code, play with it at your own speed, and start off with those really simple examples. It's really cool to see how Combine can be used. I don't use it in a ton of my applications. I'm using plain old UIKit for my professional work, but this is something that I've wanted to get into because this is basically the basis of how SwiftUI works. If you've ever heard of SwiftUI or you're looking to get into it, understanding Combine will really help you out. So this is how I'm starting. I'm going to start by playing with Combine in some simple applications. Maybe I'll work it into some professional work. It depends on the client. But by just starting to play with it, working through some simple examples, it's really going to give you a great foundation, not only for when we eventually do get into SwiftUI, but you're going to be able to leverage it and actually make use of it in your UIKit applications today. And that's kind of the goal here. So if you want to continue the journey, do hit like, do hit subscribe, come on back. We'll continue exploring Combine and eventually shifting and seeing how it works with SwiftUI, but this should give us a good starting block just to see what Combine is and how it works. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that, everyone. I hope you're having a great weekend. Come back and we'll see you soon next time. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.